Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Granara, and as Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, it's my pleasure to welcome you today to this next event on our Tunisian newsreel 2021. I want to say good afternoon to those of us on those of you on the East Coast. Good morning to those of you on the West Coast, and a hearty good evening to those of you in France and in North Africa. We're very delighted today to have Anis Marrakchi with us today. We're honored by his presence and we look forward to his talk. And I will turn over the formal protocol of introductions to our very, very capable and wonderful Siham Lamine, who is the office manager at our office in Tunisia. So, ahlan wa sahlan fi. Ahlan wa sahlan. Yalla, go on.
Thank you, Professor Granara. Welcome, everyone. And a warm welcome to all those joining for France. For once, we knew it would be happening one day or the other. So my name is Siham Lamine. As Professor Granara said, I'm the Administrative and Program Manager of the Tunisia Office of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard. And this is the second session of our Tunisian newsreel Notes from the Ground, covering the post-July 25th era. So last week we had a nice talk on the July 25 as a key moment in the country's history, democracy and affect. And this week it's a pleasure and honor to welcome Anis Marrakchi. Anis Marrakchi is a Tunisian economist. He works in the French Treasury, where he is in charge of the fiscal governance in the European Union of the bilateral economic surveillance of Greece and Italy. He is a graduate of the Ecole Polytechnique, holds a diploma in economics and statistics from ENSAE Paris, and an MA in public policy from Sciences Po Paris. Anis is one of the rising voices observing and commenting Tunisia's political economy. And while everyone tends to, analyzing Tunisia's economy, tends to point out to corruption, parallel economy, bureaucracy, debt as the main factors blocking growth, Anis, with others, talks about dysfunctionalities from within the system itself and sees the system as based on an extractive, mercantile, crony market, blocking all forms of economic creativity and initiative, and it cannot be sustained. So, Anis, I hope you agree with this little, very short introduction. Welcome. The floor is yours for the next 30 minutes, and then we will open the floor to discussion. Welcome, Anis.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Siham. I totally agree with what she said. And so let me share my screen with everyone. There.
Yes.
Yes. Great. So I'll be talking today about what I think is undermining Tunisia's economy. And so I'll directly start because 30 minutes is not a lot of time. So Tunisia is, in my opinion, what I usually call a rent-seeking economy. And if we want to be a little more specific, it would be a mercantilist, free-market economy. So what do I mean by that? What's mercantilism? Mercantilism is an economic practice that dominated policy in Europe until the 18th century. So it was the economic counterpart of political absolutism. And there were a few books that were written on this period of time. One of them, the opus of Elie Heckscher, which is called Mercantilism. If you read it today, you would feel like you were reading a book on Tunisia, even if it doesn't say Tunis or Tunisia one time. When Hernando de Soto, which is one of the great economists of our time, came in 2012 in Tunisia. So he studied the Tunisian economy post-revolution for 6 months, 1 year. And he gave a talk. And he started his talk by saying the Tunisian economy is a pre-market economy. The things that interest developing countries and Tunisia are not things that interest Europeans now. And he said what we are talking about interested them in the 17th century and the 19th century. I tell you this citation from Hernando de Soto because I think it's very true. And so I will try to explain how Tunisia is a pre-market economy, how it is a mercantilist economy, and how, when we talk about Tunisia, we need to completely forget what we learned about how a market economy should work, because Tunisia's economy follows other rules that existed in Europe before we were all born. So, one important aspect of Tunisia's economy is that it is a guild-based economy. And what do I mean by guild? Guilds and corporations in the Ancien Regime and in Tunisia, in the 19th century Tunisia, are an association of tradesmen and merchants in one field. For example, in Tunisia, we had the guild of Shawashia that make sheshiya, which is a hat, a red hat that you can see a lot in depiction of historical figures from the Arab world. So that's one particular guild, and it's not only an association of tradesmen or merchants. It has a lot of other characteristics. For example, it monopolizes its field. Only guild members are allowed to produce or sell the goods that are under the guild jurisdiction. You can't sell or produce sheshiya if you're not a member of the sheshiya corporation. The corporation has tight controls on every aspect of the production and of the commerce, of the trade of that good. It regulates methods of productions, tools, inputs, all aspects. And it has a very strict hierarchical structures. You have apprentices, journeymen, masters, and at the helm of the corporation, what we call an emir. And you can't become a master. You can't become a master easily in the biggest corporations, the biggest guilds. You can't become a master if you're not the son of the nephew of a master. So it's a very closed system, and it existed in Tunisia, in all the Arab world, and in Europe, in all of continental Europe and in the United Kingdom. But in the rest of the world, this corporatism system was abolished. In the UK, it was abolished in the course of the 18th century. In France, in 1791, and in the rest, in a big part of the countries of Europe when Napoleon imposed it on the territories he conquered. So, but in Tunisia, it was never abolished. And as a result, we still today have this guild-based economy that dictates and it is at the center of every regulation in every sector. We have what I call a guild-based economy. So I'll now give you exactly how this works in every sector of modern Tunisia. So when we talk about one economic sector or another, and we talk about who does the regulation in the sector, in France, in the UK, in the US, it's the state that regulates. In Tunisia, it's not the case. Regulation is participatory. So in every sector, in every little market, there is special structures where you have representatives from the government and representatives from the biggest actors, the biggest private actors in that sector, and they work together to regulate their sector. For example, in all the agri-food sectors, we have what we call groupement interprofessionnel. In English, it would be interprofessional groups. So we have, for example, un groupement interprofessionnel in the dates sector. So the dates is a little fruit from North Africa, and the groupement interprofessionnel is presided by 8 big actors in the sector and 4 representatives from the state. The groupement interprofessionnel did that. So he gives authorization to export dates. He sets minimal and maximal prices. He sets quality restrictions. He gives authorizations to be a date collector, and he sets the rules and the requirements to be a date collector. We have a groupement interprofessionnel in the poultry sector. So they do the same thing. They give authorization to enter the sector. They give quotas for inputs and production. We have groupement interprofessionnel in the canned industry that produces cans of canned food. We have a groupement interprofessionnel for fruits, for milk, for meat, etc., etc. And in each one of the groupement interprofessionnel is a participatory structure where private interests, and the biggest of them in that sector, will work together with representatives from the state to decide who can produce at what price, at what quantities in every sector. So this is in the agri-food sector. We have the same thing in every sector, in every industrial sector. For example, we have commissions. They are officially state commissions in ministries, but in this commission you have the same thing. You have some representatives of the state and representatives of the biggest actors of the sector that will decide on the rules that regulate that sector. Even in the big state-owned enterprises, the big monopolist state-owned enterprises, you have the same thing. For example, in Tunisia, there is a state-owned enterprise which is called the Office du Commerce, which has a monopoly on the import of coffee and tea and sugar, and in its board you have the 2 biggest private distributors of coffee and the biggest distributor of sugar, who are in its board and directly contract with it and directly set the rules and to who that state-owned enterprise should sell and at what price and what subsidies it should give, etc., etc., etc. So in most markets, access to the market is extremely difficult for new entrants because established actors are at the same time regulators of that sector. They put the rules, and they put rules that are extremely difficult, for new entrants. For example, to launch a new cement production facility, you need to have nearly $100 million of starting capital to open a payment processor and to do payment processing. You need to have a starting capital of $1.5 million. In France, it would the same thing requires a starting capital of 20,000 euros. In some sectors, it is completely impossible for new entrants to enter it. For example, the flour producers that produce flour from corn, they are represented in the board of a state-owned enterprise, and they negotiated that only a state-owned enterprise that has a monopoly on corn, and they negotiated that only them can have access to corn. Every new entrant can't buy corn, can't legally buy corn in Tunisia to produce flour. It's only them and nobody else. And this makes all those structures are little guilds, exactly like what we had in 18th century Europe, and exactly like we had in 19th century Tunisia and 18th century Tunisia before we even had industries. We had that in the handicraft sector and in commerce sector, and now we have that in the industry and service sectors. So I don't have a lot of time, so I will go fast on the next points. So this has implication on a number of policies that are followed in Tunisia, a lot of economic policies that are followed in Tunisia, and its attitude toward different type of goods. For example, for the industrial goods, the prevailing policy is what I call, and what Elie Heckscher calls, the policy of protection. So it's regulation as if it was done by the producer, and it is a regulation done by the producer. So the objective of the policy of protection is to sell as much as possible at the highest prices possible. So we prohibit imports, we subsidize exports, we fix prices as high as possible, we fix margin profit margins as high as possible, and we force producers to input producers to sell as cheaply as possible. For example, we have this a lot in the agricultural sector. So the agri-food industry forces the farmers to sell as cheaply as possible. For example, in the corn industry, and we force the consumers to buy as dearly as possible. So to give you some examples of how this works, for example, for the canned tomatoes, the canned tomato paste, we have 24 enterprises in Tunisia that are in one groupement interprofessionnel des conserves alimentaires, and they participate they are a part of the regulators. They are in a commission that regulates the tomato production by the farmers, and they set prices for the farmers that are very low. They set they set prices for the canned tomato paste that is as high as possible. They are in the state arms that give subsidies to export. So they decide they decided on subsidies for their exports. At the same time, they decided we prohibit imports of canned tomato paste, etc., etc. For the agricultural goods and the raw materials in general, what we have is a policy of provision. Here, it is the inverse of the policy of protection. We will try to prohibit exports, subsidize imports, fix prices as low as possible, and force producers to sell as cheaply as possible. We have a hunger of these goods. We want as much as possible, as cheaply as possible. And so we will force farmers, for example, in the corn farmers, they are obligated to sell to state monopoly that only buys from them 25% under the international market price. They are not allowed to sell to anyone else, or they go to prison. We talked about tomatoes a while earlier. Is the same thing. They are obligated to sell at a fixed price that is very low and is very seldom updated. It's seldom updated at all. And we have the same thing for raw materials. So we will try to subsidize their import. For example, in many sectors, we will have raw materials that have a low tariff, trade tariff on imports, and the semi-products that have a higher tariff, and the finished products that have a very high tariff. For example, for cocoa, for chocolate, chocolates have a very high tariff, and the raw cocoa have a very low tariff, and semi-products have a highish tariff. And so we only have one producer of chocolate in Tunisia that have a quasi monopoly, because he's the only one that has a capacity to transform raw cocoa, and all the others have to buy from him, but he refuses to sell them, and he's the only producer of chocolate. And this policy of provision, sometimes it works hand in hand with the policy of protection. For example, that's what we had with the chocolate sector. The chocolate producer is protected from every entrant, is protected from imports, from exports, and his raw materials benefit from the policy of provision. He has as much as he wanted. As we want from those. It has synergy too, because it keeps agricultural goods good prices low. So industrialists, etc., have cheap labor. But it can also conflict with the policy of protection. For example, every year in Tunisia, in the milk sector, we have phases. So in the first phase, we will prohibit imports of milk and subsidize exports. We will give subsidies to the milk industrialists that produces bottled milk, etc. So that we help him export. He is a quasi monopoly with more than 80% of the market. And when the cows are in a low lactation period, the cows are owned by small farmers. We will do exactly the inverse. So we will subsidize imports, and we will subsidize that monopoly so it can import bottled milk. So every 6 months, farmers either don't produce enough milk for the country, or they produce too much milk and have to spill it on the road. And at every point, the industrial producer of bottled milk is subsidized either to import or to export bottled milk. Last but not least, we have the staple policy. This is the regulation as done by the merchant, when the one that does the regulation is the merchant. So he will just try to monopolize the trade, to buy it as cheaply as possible and sell it as dearly as possible. And we have that, for example, for the olive oil. Olive oil in Tunisia, only a small number of exporters have the right to export olive oil. So we will subsidize their export. We will subsidize imports of soja oil, etc. So the farmer that produce olive oil have to sell to them have to sell their oil at a low price to the exporters. We will have that for imports of cars. A small number of car importers have the right to import cars, and they have specific quotas from them, etc., etc. We have that for dates, as we talked about earlier. Just a limited number of date dealers have the right to export dates, and they give authorization to export dates only to themselves. They have the right to give export licenses, and they only give them to themselves. So they monopolize the trade. Every foreign merchant that want to buy or sell one of those products or others in Tunisia can do it on his own. He has legally to associate with one of those one of those established local merchants, etc., etc. So this is the attitude toward goods that is the consequence of what we called our guild-based economy, and we have a lot of other consequences. So I don't have a lot of time left, so I will try to go a little faster. So, for example, the attitude toward hard currency, euros and dollars. In Tunisia, we have an obsession towards hard currency. And if you come to Tunisia, you will see that a lot of the political discussion about economy is about FDIs. We want to have a lot of investment, of foreign investment in Tunisia, but we don't have. So I asked three ex-prime ministers and two ministers, ex-ministers of economy and finance, one simple question. I told them, you have two foreign investors. The first one tells you, I have 100 million euros. I want to come to Tunisia, give the 100 million euros to the central bank, and I will buy with that foreign machines, and I will make in Tunisia a factory for cars and for motors and whatever. And I will produce cars and motors, and I will invest in Tunisia, and I will sell cars to Tunisians. And you have a second investor that comes and says, I have 100 million euros. I will give them to the central bank. I will get 300 million dinars, and I will buy sand, because I like sand. I want to make sand castles in the desert. And I asked them, which one would the Tunisian state prefer? They all said the second one, because what we want in Tunisia is not foreign investment. What we want is hard currency in the central bank. The first one is not gonna give hard currency to the central bank. He's just gonna buy machines and invest and produce cars. The second one doesn't produce anything. but he gives a hard currency to the central bank. And that's what we like, that's what we want. We don't want foreign investments, we want hard currency. And that goes very well with the policy of protection, the policy, and even the policy of provision. A lot of Tunisia's policies are centered around this need, this hunger for hard currency. So Tunisian can't have access to hard currency. It's only the central bank and some authorized actors. If you want to go and visit another country, you have a limited small sum that you can take with you. You can't buy something on Amazon, or you can't use PayPal. You can't Bitcoins and all other cryptocurrency are prohibited in Tunisia because you can exchange hard currency with them, etc., etc. All that is prohibited. We built a cage for hard currency in Tunisia, and what enters can never go out. Even international companies that want to quit Tunisia and go somewhere else can get their money out. And it involves a lot of the discussion between ambassadors and etc. turn around that problem. So we have other aspects of this policy is the attitude toward workers and salaries. So workers are private sector workers are not represented in any of those guild-like structures that we talked about. So workers, so we have a policy in Tunisia for moderating the salaries of workers in all of the private sector. Even the policy of provision toward agricultural goods is one part of that. Keeping foodstuff prices low helps keeping salaries low. And it goes hand in hand with the policy of protection, which allows manufacturers to have cheap workers, etc., etc. And as with workers, farmers and consumers, etc., are not represented in all of those guild-like structures. So in Tunisia, land rights are very, very shallow, if I can say that. Only 10% of agricultural land have a land title, and more than half of those land titles are of those 10% are commonly owned and can't be sold or anything else, etc. In Tunisia, only 30 to 35% of the population have access to a bank account. Most private banks don't even have bank branches in the interior parts of Tunisia because they are not required to, and it's easier to stay on the richer parts. And only 8% of Tunisians have access to credit, and all the other don't. So when you go in Tunisia, and in a lot of developing countries, you will see houses that are half built. They are not completely built. They are just half built, and nobody's building nobody's building them. They are just left half built like that. It's everywhere, in cities, in rural parts of Tunisia, everywhere. And so you ask yourself, why? You don't see that in developed countries. And that's because people don't have access to financing. If you don't have access to financing, if you don't have access to bank accounts, when you have money, what do you do with it? If you have 2,000 dinars, which is a currency in Tunisia, and you don't have access to a bank account, you can't keep it in your house. You will get robbed, you will get assaulted, whatever. So you will buy some bricks, a little cement, and you will build one layer of your wall. you are what you are doing is that's saving. What you see, those half-built houses, they are saving. Savings of people that don't have access to bank accounts, and so they save in hard bricks and mortar and cement. And when they have a little bit of money, they build another layer, etc., etc., etc. And building like this costs 2 to 3 times more. They don't have land titles, so the house that they build is valued 5 times less than a house with a land title, and so they are losing 10 times the value of their house because of this. And my time is up, so the floor
You still have 5 minutes to conclude.
No, it's okay. I just finished.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Anis. So we'll start with the questions. There's one that's really interesting in the chat, so I'll read it. So the policies you outlined, policies of protection, provision, and availability of staples, function by means of a cash economy. Has a barter economy developed within which producers and consumers might escape the disadvantageous effects of the de facto economic policies you described? If I understand well, barter economy is sort of drug economy. So an alternative to this insidious protection.
Yes. Great. Yes, in Tunisia, 50% of workers and enterprises are informal ones. The informal sector is hard to quantify. Some say 30 or 35%, whatever. For example, agricultural goods, they are some agricultural goods are required to be sold in what we call marché de gros, big markets that are state-owned and where they have to pay at specific prices and pay specific internal tolls, etc., etc. We estimate that those marchés de gros only see 7% of the agricultural product that they should pass from there. So a lot of the real economy goes in informal parts that the state don't have a lot. State and all those guild regulated whatever they don't have a lot of power over them, over this informal part of the economy. So it is, for example, in Tunisia, the biggest billet bank note is the 50 dinars bank note. So the 50 dinars bank note, you can sell it at 55 dinars. You can have a premium of 10% and you can sell it at 55 dinars because this informal economy that can't work with banks, work only in cash, etc., and in barter economy. And so they need the big notes. So they will buy notes, the biggest notes, and the biggest note is valued 10% more than it should be.
A second question is if the state is keeping this economic and financial system, it must have an interest in that. What are these interests according to you, that even democracy and citizens' participation in government could not change?
Okay, the state has a lot of interests in that. One of the interests is fiscalism. It's a lot easier when you don't have a lot of administrative capability to tax one big monopoly than 1,000 small actors that you can follow and that are disseminated in every part of the country. It's a lot easier to just give a privilege, producing privilege to authorization to only 1 or 2 or 3 big actors that you can tax easily, that you can follow easily, than to have a liberty of industry where everyone can produce anything, and then you have to follow every small actor, etc., which you can do. That's the first. That's one of the first interests of the state. The second one is patronage. If you give liberty of industry, liberty of commerce to everyone, your political opponents can make money, can have enterprises, can have companies, can become rich, and then they can go against you. When you are the one that decides who gets in that sector and who don't, you don't have political enemies or opponents that can become rich or whatever. So it is at the same time a mean to reward loyal entrepreneurs, and to punish disloyal ones. And this mentality doesn't change when you have parties, etc. Parties will try to give privileges to people that are from them, etc., etc. A third motivation of the state is social peace and social stability. For example, I'll give you an example. In 2014, the World Bank came and said the canned tomato paste sector, this is not how a market economy should work. You should have price liberty. You should have set whatever price you want, and the competition will work and prices will go down. But that was completely off the mark, because they didn't understand how it worked, that all these 24 companies are in one groupement interprofessionnel, and that they set every aspect of the market together. They market shares, what they sell, etc., etc. They all by law are required to give this groupement interprofessionnel every contract that they sign, every vendor that they have a relation with, etc., etc., etc. So they all have complete information on each other, and they form a very tight-knit corporation and cartel. So as soon as the price limit was taken off, they all fixed the same price to the millim for the 24 companies on all the country, in all of the territory, and and in 6 years prices have gone. The prices went up 100%. One key justification why the state does that is that he can put maximum prices. The state is represented in these guilds, so the private actors try to put a price that is as high as possible, and the state will try to put a maximum price to have price stability, because in a country where you have a lot of people that are earning very low wages, price fluctuations can be very socially disturbative. So the state put maximum prices, maximum margins on a lot of sectors, from underwears to whatever, to fish to everything, and it put maximum prices. Those maximum prices are high. They give companies a high markup, but it gives price stability. And so no fluctuation of prices, no huge fluctuation in prices, which keeps social stability. So the state has a lot of gains a lot of things from that, and political actors gain a lot from that.
I'll continue with, I think it's a follow-up of this same question. So do you think that the free trade agreements since 1995 have mitigated this rent-seeking economy? And if not, why?
No, not at all, because as I said it a little in the staple policy part. In Tunisia, you can't sell something if you are a foreign merchant if you're not associated with a local merchant. It's not possible. It's possible in very few sectors, and the vast majority of sectors prohibit that. There are specific policies that prohibit direct commerce between the exterior market and the internal market, and the link between those two, between the external market and the internal market, are some key and very powerful business families that have privileges, tariff privileges that only them have. For example, to import steel, everyone pays 15 to 20% tariff, but two families have a privilege that waives these tariffs. The same thing we have in a lot of sectors, this makes it that for a normal Tunisian, he can't have access to the foreign market in any conceivable way.
So, and it's a very important question. How aware are the Tunisian people and the governing elites of what you have described? If they are aware, is this something they would like to change? And what are, in your view, the obstacles to reform?
Are they aware? No, they are more and more aware, because with the democratization of Tunisia, well, speaking is easier. So a lot of these businessmen, etc., they were from the close family of Ben Ali. So you couldn't say what I say now. If I said this 15 years ago, I couldn't go back to Tunisia. If you take all what has been written in Tunisia from the 18th century till now, you won't find one Tunisian that said corporatism is bad, or even in the handicraft sector. You won't find writings that will say guilds are bad. Guilds are bad. This never has been written by a Tunisian in Tunisia until very recently. So people are getting more and more aware now than they were before, yes, it pushes from some changes, but we have a long road in front of us.
Another question. So did you work on the sectoral mapping of these families? Do you know who they are and with the companies they manage and own? Or is this all based on a research, like it's a research hypothesis?
There is one researcher, Mohamed Ziye Hamemi, that is working on a network for this. For now, you only have some small size research on public companies only. So he is working on something that is also private companies too, etc., etc. But identifying the actors is not in itself very useful. In every sector, you will have different actors. What is important is how it works. So in every developed country, the one that does the regulation in a sector is the state. The state regulates whatever, who can sell and how you can sell matches. In Tunisia, it's not the case. In Tunisia, the big actors in one sector are those that put the rules of that sector, are those that write the regulations, and they are the ones that enforce them. And this is why it's not a market economy. There is no the supply and demand. For example, we had a case not long ago in the steel sector. There is two big producers of steel in Tunisia that have import privileges for their raw materials, and one of them decided that he wanted the prices that are fixed with the government to be higher. So he stopped selling steel to force the minister to raise prices. So this is not supply, this is not demand. In the market economy, someone else would have produced steel or imported steel, and his action wouldn't have any impact at all. In Tunisia, it had a huge impact because it stopped. A lot of people couldn't find steel to build houses or whatever else.
Anis, to what countries can Tunisia be compared? And are these examples of successful, are there examples of successful transition to market economy?
Yes, Europe. Europe is a case of successful transition toward the market economy. They started, if you read about 18th century France, you change the names and you are talking about Tunisia. You change Ben Ali by Louis XIV, you change Paris by Tunis, you change whatever, and you are reading about Tunisia. And they transition toward a market economy. How? For example, in 1774, there was what would now be called the prime minister of Louis XVI, which is called Turgot, who was called Turgot, sorry. And in 1776, Turgot said, "I will abolish all corporations. From now on, all corporations are abolished, and everyone has the right to sell and produce and buy whatever he wants." So what happened is that 2 months later he was evicted, and his decision was repealed. But 13 years later, there was the French Revolution, and his edict was put back in place in full force, and all the corporations were abolished. People had the right to produce, to sell, to buy whatever they wanted. And when Napoleon fought the other European countries, he forced the same rules in all those countries. He expropriated and abolished guilds and corporations in Belgium, in Switzerland, etc., and put back the same rules in the Code Napoleon, etc. So
I believe the question was about a bit more recent success stories from the South, ideally, or from the Arab world, or from Asia.
There is no success story in the Arab world. The countries that do that, they go from GDP per capita in the 5,000 to GDP per capita in the 40,000. You have Singapore, you have South Korea. That's it.
If I may ask a question, so
Taiwan, maybe.
There's one. Sorry.
Taiwan maybe, but I don't know a lot
yes.
about Taiwan. I don't know a lot about Taiwan.
My question is, okay, if the system is that locked, would it be, so how does it work with very new markets like IT markets, things that did not exist before and that are created, or cultural markets, or all of these very new technologies that create an economy, like chains, new chains? How does that, are they locked too? Like immediately when they appear, they get absorbed?
Either they are locked as soon as they appear, as soon as someone establishes a foothold, the state comes and tells, let's do a commission where you are and you decide on the rules in this sector. This is the first way it is handled. We have a lot of examples of that. The second way is that it is prohibited. In any case, for example, we don't have payment processors in Tunisia. Payment processors, établissement paiement. It's like PayPal, etc. It's prohibited. PayPal doesn't operate in Tunisia. Another example would be whatever cryptocurrencies. They are prohibited in Tunisia, etc., etc. Holding bitcoins would, if you hold bitcoins, you can end up in prison. One guy spent 6 months or more in prison because he had been paid in bitcoins for a gig job that he did.
Indeed. Yes. So very, very quickly, we have like 3 minutes left. Abolishing the groupement professionnel by the government can be done in 1 day by just a signature. Do you think this will have an immediate positive impact in the markets?
Well, it can be done in 1 day. It's a law, so you have to pass a law, but it can be done very quickly. Yes. The truth of the fact is that the truth of the matter is that the government don't have this analysis and don't want to have it because, as we said, they gain a lot from the system that we have now, and they don't have an alternative. They don't know what they would put if they abolish that. This is a big question for them, for a lot of governance. If they say, if I abolish the authorization for people to do nets, just nets, who would tell me that tomorrow we won't have nets of poor quality? So we have to have someone that tell you have the right to make nets and you don't have the right to make nets. They can't comprehend liberty of doing the trade that you want and the industry that you want.
Okay, a note of hope. Would you have that for us?
A note of hope. If you are aware of this, and if we talk about it, it will change because it is such a big drain on the economy, on everyone's livelihood, that it can only persist if no one talks about it and no one knows about it. If we know it, if we talk about it, there will have such a huge momentum against it that it will fall.
I agree.
That's the only hope I can give.
That's already a lot. Professor Granara, would you like to say a word? Please activate your microphone.
No, for you have the last word, Denise, but I wanted to thank you very much for this very rich presentation. You give us much to think about. Also, you talk about areas that we here in especially in the United States, we know little about. We concentrate a lot on the political situation and in the COVID situation, but sometimes we're not focused on this. I'm just, I won't ask for an answer, but all of the, with all of the rapid changes that are going on right now, and something in the way of a hopeful or maybe not so hopeful future for Tunisia, that maybe there's a ray of hope that the economic policies will change with the political policies and the structure. I'm just throw that out as something of a provocative final comments, and I just give you the last word on that.
So on that, the actual president now, so he sees that there is a problem, and I think he is honest in his want to go against that, but he doesn't. He's less skilled in economy than in other matters, and so his solution is to fix prices and to force producers to unite in guilds, so he can tell them to put prices down. So he's just doing the last function of the state that we said in the third one, keeping social stability by putting maximum prices, maximum markups, etc., etc. And he's perpetuating the same system. I don't think that it will change just because the head of the state changed.
I see. Again, thank you very much. We very much appreciate this, and welcome to the Harvard community of scholars. We look forward to seeing you again someday, either virtually or in the flesh, as we say. But I wish you, on behalf of the university and CHAM, good health and prosperity, and continue this wonderful research that you're doing as well. As the French say, bonne continuation économique. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the incredible
insights,
Anis. Next, Tunisia Newsreel is with Muheb Garoui on corruption, and that's on November 3rd. And if you're interested in Libya, so this is for the audience, so next week on October 21st, we have a talk also on the urban economies of Libyan cities. So please do stay tuned. Anis, thank you. I'll be telling everyone about your sand castles in the desert example tomorrow. Thank you for accepting this invitation, and we'll see you all soon.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.